Hello, and welcome back to Mr. Smock's American History class. We are jumping into the decade of the Roaring Twenties. We're going to talk about the politics, the different administrations, the different changing paths, both domestically and foreignly. And we're going to talk about the cultural and societal life of the 1920s and how that changes throughout the decade. So our first lesson, kind of here's where we're at following World War I, just a post-war America snapshot. What does it look like? First and foremost, America is exhausted, mentally, physically. They are exhausted. Americans are because, one, the League of Nations political debate has divided America into the supporters and those who do not support the League of Nations. And it stretches on for months, over 6 months of debate. And ultimately, it is defeated. The League of Nations will not be joined by the United States as a greater part of the Treaty of Versailles, which is denied by the United States, and we will not sign into that. Much like an election year like 2020, the election cycle continually barrages people, and it's constantly in the news. And because of that, a lot of Americans get mentally wore out from having to deal with that conversation on a daily basis. That's kind of the basis for the League of Nations and why mentally people are exhausted. The progressive era is going to come to an end. So you had presidents like Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson that fought for the populist movement, the individual people, the rights, women's voting rights, and workmen's compensation and safety in the workplace. And you had this progressive movement that went on for 20 years, for 2 decades. And following the war, there's this huge about-face, 180-degree turn that America takes, no longer on progressivism, but on conservatism. America goes back conservatively, looking at how we can adjust life to benefit America and return ourselves to the era before World War I, if that's even possible. And as extension of all of this, our economy is going to slow. The war is over. Government's not subsidizing, government's not buying stuff from industries, so our economy is going to slow down, and that's going to hurt everybody: farmers, factory workers, owners. On another note, your soldiers that are going to return home from the war, a lot of them are going to find out that their jobs were taken either by African Americans or by their countrymen that stayed home and worked, or by women in the workplace, and they're going to be jobless, and that's going to have a major impact on the returning soldiers. Political cartoon talking about the Treaty of Versailles, and by extension, the League of Nations. Like a Roman arch, the League of Nations was perceived to be this perfect structure that could withstand any pressure from any angle if all of the right pieces were in place. As you can see, this bridge of a metaphorical bridge between two sides, over conflict. You have Belgium and France and Italy and England that are all signed in, creating this bridge, but it's missing the most key part of the structure. The keystone in the Roman arch is the key part. And when you insert that, the more pressure you exert from the top down, the stronger the structure gets. And without the keystone, it's an incredibly weak structure. And the United States never joins, and this political cartoon signifies that without the United States as the keystone, the League of Nations is going to be an incredibly weak structure, an incredibly weak organization. So the question is, why didn't the League of Nations include the United States? Why did we, as the United States, not join the League of Nations? It's very simple. Article 10 of the Treaty of Versailles stated the establishment of the League of Nations, and that member nations would be obligated to interfere if a conflict happened amongst other nations. And so the United States would have to send in its military to stop a conflict. And by extension, then member nations could not declare war on each other. And that took one of Congress's powers to declare war out of the Constitution. And we can't have a organization that has more power than the Constitution. So by definition, the Constitution would come in second to the League of Nations. And the United States says, nope, we're not going to join because of that fact, and we will shoot it down. So the United States also befalls this idea of isolationism. Like a toddler, a 18-month-old little boy, little toddler, always wants to be around, always curious, always seeing what's going on. The United States is much like that in the early 1900s, looking out, seeing what new territories are out there. Very, very curious. When the war comes, I use the analogy of a hot oven door and a toddler. I'm hoping my toddler son never does this, but hot oven door opens, toddler is curious, just like the United States was. We want to get involved. We want to go over there, and we touch that hot oven surface, 350 degrees. The first thing, before you can even think, your body does is you recoil in pain to get away from whatever the bad thing was. And that's what the United States was. The hot oven door was the war. We got involved. We got burned, metaphorically speaking, and we recoil. That recoil is isolationism, coming back into our shell, worrying about ourselves. Okay, before all the yelling and screaming takes place, we come back, we lock down our borders as much as we can. We say we're going to focus on us. We're not going to be involved in this international affair, international politics. We are just going to be America. And with isolationism comes the idea of nativism. Anybody that's natively born in the United States, that means that you were born here in the United States, is somehow better, superior, has more rights, is flaunted more than somebody who is not, somebody that might have been born and immigrated here. Somehow the native born is better. And that comes back to isolationism, because America is very fearful of outsiders. We have seen the global conflict and all the bloodshed and how horrible things were in Europe. So we're not necessarily that we're afraid of Europe, but we don't want to go back to Europe. We saw that outsiders have these scary ideas, these contradicting ideas to our way of life, things like communism and anarchy, and we don't want those things. Those are scary aspects, because we saw what those things have done to the Soviet Union. We've seen what those have done to other nations, and that there's a huge number of immigrants coming into the United States, not from the countries that share our beliefs, but there's a lot of immigrants coming in from countries that have these contrary ideas. And so America becomes very fearful of outsiders. And that leads us in to the first major lesson, other than where America stands. The second lesson today is prohibition. Okay. Prohibition is the manufacture, sale, transportation of alcoholic beverages being legally prohibited in the United States following the 18th Amendment. In 1920, on January 1st, the United States becomes a quote-unquote dry nation. 36 of our 48 states will initially sign on, saying that they will enforce laws to different degrees. Even though it's federal law, we have states that will enforce it very full-heartedly, as much as they can, and you'll have states that are like, yes, it's a federal law, but we're not going to pay much homage to it. Oddly enough, states like that might be neighbors. For example, New York State will follow these prohibition laws to the letter. They will establish commissions and groups who are trying to go out and actively rid New York State of alcoholic beverages, whereas then their neighbor Pennsylvania will have some of the laxest laws and kind of take the approach of see no evil, act upon no evil. And for 13 years, states are going to have the ability to enforce these laws to varying degrees. So New York State, as I said, is the poster child. Here you see that there's state workers that are destroying the kegs of beer out in New York Harbor. They're enforcing it. And a lot of these alcoholic beverages were legally they would be legally seized, but they were voluntarily given to the state officials for people saying, it's the law now. I'm going to give up all of my alcohol. Here you go. Do with it what you please. And in the second picture here, you have groups of people who are just draining kegs of beer into the storm drains. Kind of as a side note here, not great drainage, not great storm drain and drainage for the era. So as the beer would ferment in the storm drains, it would cause a very foul odor. And New York City specifically had about a 6-week period of time where it smelled like decomposing alcohol. And then so here you have the wine, the spirits, the liquor, the harder alcohol that's being dumped into the storm drain, celebrations, people watching it. You have different groups that are responsible for this. First, you have the Anti-Saloon League, who campaigned against saloons, that they were evil. The whole purpose of saloon had in existing was so that they could sell alcohol. And alcohol, obviously, under prohibition's evil. And then you had the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who's going to be the pushing force because of the domestic violence that's happened in the home. Unfortunately, and we talked a little bit about that in the first chapter about why domestic violence was happening in the home. Okay, so I got to take a little break from talking about prohibition here and talk about fundamentalism. Huge pushing factor behind why all of these changes are happening. There's a large religious revival where people in America are starting to attend church, Christian church, in larger numbers. This religious movement is sweeping across the nation. So as they attend church, your pastors, your preachers, your bishops, whatever you call the man or woman behind the pulpit, they are having a larger influence, and fundamentalism is a part of this religious push where you live your life according to what the Bible says, not based upon a modern day interpretation. No, you take it exactly as it is. And so this awakening is having a massive push into social life. And so as people are following fundamentalism in their religious life, it's also now alcohol is an evil. It's the work of the devil, and you need to rid yourself of those things. So just because there's laws in place doesn't necessarily mean that you follow the law. For instance, I'm pretty sure that all of us have broken the speed limit. You've gone 66 or faster on the highway outside of McCook. I'm willing to bet that you've also taken a sick day when you're not actually sick. Those are examples of breaking the law. One's federal, one's state. But just because it's law doesn't mean people follow the law. People would open up private saloons called speakeasies, where they would allow people in to drink, and you didn't speak about these speakeasies outside because they could get shut down, and you did not speak loudly, you did not get belligerently drunk while inside of these speakeasies because you didn't want anybody outside to know what was going on. Many of these speakeasies are owned by organized crime, and they have supply lines. They have bootleggers who are willing to transport all of this alcohol. And they were very, very creative. Hollow areas within the dashes, transporting at night. They found ways to get around the police and around the federal investigators. Here in the picture, you have the cavity behind the speedometer where they would stash alcohol and then unload. The pop culture favorite TV show Dukes of Hazzard was basically about prohibition in modern day, where some counties in the United States today still have prohibition laws, or they're dry. They don't sell alcohol. People that are bootlegging and opening up these speakeasies are making hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. So it's very profitable. And this is where organized crime comes in. Here you have Al Capone, one of the most notorious mobsters in American history. His life is pretty simple. He starts out, he joins a mob family, he works his way up through the ranks, and he's going to take over and organize this family. He is going to encompass alcohol, transportation, bootlegging. He's also going to have prostitution, drugs, gambling. And so he's making all of this money through illegal means. But the feds can never put their finger on him. He's very, very clever in how he organizes his business structure. So throughout the course of his business, he is going to have rivals. First of all, the thing's going to really start toppling his demise and put him under the public radar is the fact that a rival gang comes in and tries to muscle into his alcohol area. And most of the cops were on the payroll. So there'd be a shakedown where if the police saw you, they'd walk in, they'd frisk you, you'd throw a couple $1,000s on the ground, they'd slyly pick it up. So if anybody was looking, it looked like you were arresting these people. And then the cops would walk away and everything was hunky-dory. This rival mob gang is in on this. And so they have this alcohol, and they see this group of police officers who are actually Al Capone's men disguised as police officers. And they walk in, the guys throw the money on the ground, allow themselves to be frisked, except they're not getting frisked. Al Capone's men open fire and kill all 10 men in there. It's called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And he leaves the bodies, he leaves the money, he leaves the alcohol. It's a statement to stay away from his business territory. And this puts him on the FBI's #1 most wanted list because they know it's him. They just can't prove that it's him. They ultimately will catch him for tax evasion. And it was very clever. His paper trail didn't lead right to him. His bookie would have a name and then an identification code or an identification number. And that's all they would have. So it would really mean nothing by itself. But if you had his book, his ledger, and you put it together with his bookie's ledger, then you'd be able to identify, because in his, he would have the identification number and the amount of money that was owed, the amount of money was paid. So when during the course of a couple of raids, they get these two ledgers, they put them together, they find out that he had made X amount of money and never paid income tax on it. So he's arrested, he's sentenced to 15 years in prison, and then he will be released. And a few months after he's released, he will die. He actually contracted syphilis before going to prison, and late-stage syphilis will eat away at your brain like a Swiss cheese block. So with that brings about the end of this lesson, and we will be back with lesson 3 shortly.